in real life, I see more biracial men that look like this as opposed to this. Hi everyone, my name is Vina, aka Miss WC Reader, and welcome back to my channel. Today I wanted to talk about colorism in Black fantasy, and no, this is not a discussion of Children of Blood and Bone and the casting surrounded by that. Enough of you have let your opinion be known. I wanted to talk more about a trend that I've noticed the past few years, and I just really don't see enough people talking about. So I want to preface this by saying I don't think that every love interest in a Black fantasy needs to be Black. However, it's not lost on me that it becomes harder to find a Black love interest in many of these stories. And so often, when I do find a Black love interest, it feels like a special event. And that is crazy to me, especially in the books that are African inspired. There's always some random non-Black person that has to show up in the story. When I read like Asian fantasy, for example, I don't see that. So it's also not lost on me that our Black authors make sure to include so many different races and cultures, but those characters are not present in those other group stories. So I don't think that we always need a Black love interest, but it feels kind of fetishy in some ways when I'm reading some of these stories, and it's something that you really do need to pay more attention to the text. See how Black people are described in the book in comparison to the non-Black characters. The first time I noticed this kind of biracial white passing love interest was in Within These Wicked Walls by Lauren Blackwood. It wasn't lost on me that she chose Ethiopia as a setting, a country that has never been colonized, and decided to make the love interest a white passing biracial who has British parentage. But it's not just Within These Wicked Walls where that white passing biracial love interest is present. It's also House of Marion, Forged by Blood, which Forged by Blood was set in a fantasy version of Nigeria. And in this fantasy version of Nigeria, there are colonizers that have taken over, and they are oppressing the dark-skinned underclass. The fated mate aspect has our main character fated to this colonizer prince. And I believe, like, through his mom, he has a little bit of Black heritage, if I recall correctly. But he is still, like, blonde hair, pale skin, blue eyes, and a colonizer at that. He is positioned as the better choice than her Black, albeit also light-skinned as well, best friend who she's grown up with. So as I was reading at first, I thought everybody was Black in the story because I'm like, oh, you know, it's African inspired, everybody's gonna be Black. But then it wasn't till I saw the Fairy Loot special edition and I saw what the characters look like, and I'm just like, wait, hold up, that's a white man.
This is a white.
And when I saw that, it made me think more, because I already thought the whole colonizer thing was problematic in and of itself, and some of the messaging in regards to not fighting back or you'll be as bad as the people who are oppressing you were bad. But that just blew my mind. And it really made me think about what kind of messaging we were sending in this story. Because even in fantasy Africa, we can't escape white people and their phenotype is pedestal. I also noticed a lot of colorism recently in An Academy for Liars by Alexis Henderson. This wasn't something I really saw very many people call out. Even people I expected to notice it and be more critical said nothing. They were just able to read past it, and maybe they were just reading the book for the vibes. I don't think there's a problem necessarily reading books for vibes, but you do need to be kind of somewhat aware of what you're consuming because of things like this. Like, I noticed that the characters in that book were defaulted to white, and as far as black identity, we got very little description of what the main character or her love interest looked like. Again, when he was described, it was very weird because she basically described him as he was black like her, but also clearly mixed with white. That in and of itself didn't sit right with me. Then there was a point in the book where she sees a dark-skinned boy and just automatically assumes he's Nigerian. And she says she's right, he's Nigerian. She has a knack for these things, she knows. He didn't even open his mouth, he was just dark-skinned. That was very weird to me. Because Nigerian does not have a specific look, and what makes somebody look more Nigerian as opposed to African American, as opposed to West Indian, as opposed to just any other type of West African? Is whenever people say that they can tell somebody is Nigerian versus African American versus Caribbean, it's always ridiculous. And I felt that kind of played into that by saying, oh, like, African American people aren't generally dark skinned, that which we know is not true. So that was weird. And then also in that same book, the way in which she described the white girls as like beautiful, like strikingly so, even though they were like starving model body types, like very weighty and super skinny, that was also very weird to me. And I don't know if that's just something that's so ingrained to the author, having grown up in a very white environment, that she did not even realize what she was writing. But that's why when we're reading these books, we need to point things like that out. Because that's something where if you grew up around mostly white people and seeing white as the beauty standard, that wouldn't faze you. If you are a white person, that wouldn't faze you. But as somebody who is a dark-skinned black woman, it did kind of make me pause a little bit. Especially when you already have this very racially ambiguous looking love interest. And I'm not saying that like everybody who is the black love interest needs to be dark skinned, but it's very noticeable when you're reading these stories and it's favoring towards a more white look. If a black male fantasy author wrote a fantasy where there already weren't a lot of black people in the story to begin with, and then the main representation for black women was somebody who looked like Nicole and Sophia Richie, people would have an issue. People would make it known they had an issue. We would see short form videos about it. We would see long form videos about it. We would see a write-up in Essence magazine talking about it. It would be a big deal, and that man would be heavily critiqued for why he wrote this the way he did. And the word colorism would come up, and people would be trying to break down why this man has a preference for lighter skinned, white looking women. Yet, we are getting multiple fantasy books in a row by black women, and it's also not lost on me that it is black women who are married to black men who are the main ones writing the story. Because this is something that I noticed a lot in romance, and we've called it out sometimes in romance how colorism can seep into contemporary romance, where you'll have some of these authors like talking about, and he was sexy because he looked mixed, because he had green eyes, and they just go in. And people talk about colored eyes very differently than they talk about brown eyes. So we've called it out a little bit in contemporary contemporary romance, but I don't think we've ever really acknowledged it in fantasy, even though it's becoming more prominent. Like, I have noticed that so many of these authors are writing these stories, and there is this like completely non-black, so like Asian or just white love interest, or white passing biracial love interest, and then their partner is a black man. And it's like, why are we still doing this? And I know people will make the argument, well, publishing is hard to break into, so sometimes you have to write these types of stories to get your book published. And I don't really agree with that. I do feel like we're already fighting to get our black stories out there. Just go the extra mile and fight for the black love interest as well. But also, some of these books are being written by women who are like at least on book 3. So my thing is, when does it become easier on your publishing journey to be able to include something that more reflects your reality? And when I see the Asian love interest often in these stories, I notice that while our black characters, their culture is at the forefront, the way in which the world engages with them as a black person is at the forefront. With these Asian love interests, it's almost as if their culture and their skin color and looks disappears. They are essentially just a stand-in as an of-color version of the white male love interest. Despite being from a completely different background as the main character, no matter what the time period is it's set in, because I've read it in historical fantasy, and I've read it in like sci fantasy, and I've read it in ones that heavily talk about racism. I've read it in contemporary. It never comes up in the conversation, even though realistically in most of our families, if you date outside of your race, it's going to become a conversation just amongst your friends and family. It never becomes a conversation of how they're going to navigate the world. We're just supposed to assume that there's no issues there, that person has family, their family is fully accepting. And again, their culture never has a factor on anything. It's so weird to me how that's written and that's just accepted. So I just, like I said, was noticing this pattern a lot, and it feels very icky. And I am asking people when they're reading these books, because we're always talking about this story was talked about this important issue and this important issue, to also engage with that as well. To also understand why in our book, where many times we are talking about race and the way that it affects us, that we are still perpetuating that racism and colorism through who is seen as the object of desire. let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section down below. And if you like this video, make sure and hit that like button. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye!